Bushido, Soul of Japan, translated by the Rising Word. Chapter 7. Veracity and Sincerity. Without veracity and sincerity, politeness becomes nothing more than a farce, an empty show. As Masamune wisely observed, propriety carried beyond right bounds becomes a lie. An ancient poet, offering advice that surpasses even Polonius, wrote, "To thyself be faithful. If in thy heart thou strayest not from truth, without prayer of thine the gods will keep thee whole." Confucius, in his Doctrine of the Mean, elevated sincerity to divine heights. He proclaimed sincerity as both the beginning and end of all things, stating that without sincerity nothing could exist. He eloquently described its far-reaching and enduring power, its ability to bring about change without physical effort, and its capacity to achieve its purpose simply through its presence. The Chinese character for sincerity, a combination of the symbols for word and perfect, invites a parallel to the Neoplatonic concept of logos, a reflection of how deeply Confucius explored this idea in his rare mystic ascent. Lying or equivocation was considered equally cowardly by the samurai. The Bushi believed that his elevated social position demanded a higher standard of truthfulness than that expected of tradesmen or peasants. The phrase Bushi no Ichigon, the word of a samurai, was akin to the German Ritterwort, or knight's word, and served as an absolute guarantee of truth. The samurai's word carried such weight that promises were made and kept without the need for written agreements, which were seen as beneath his dignity. Many gripping tales recount samurai who paid with their lives for breaking this standard of sincerity. The term nigon, literally double tongue, referred to dishonesty, and those guilty of it often atoned through death. The samurai's regard for veracity was so profound that, unlike many Christians who routinely disregard the clear command of their teacher not to swear, the best of the samurai considered taking an oath a slight to their honor. While they did occasionally swear by deities or upon their swords, such acts never descended into casual or irreverent expressions. To emphasize the gravity of their words, samurai sometimes resorted to literally sealing their promises with blood, a practice evocative of the pact in Goethe's Faust. A contemporary American writer has claimed that if you ask an average Japanese person whether it is better to tell a falsehood or to be impolite, they will unhesitatingly choose to lie. Dr. Peary's statement is partially correct and partially misguided. He is correct that many Japanese, including samurai, might indeed answer as he describes. However, he misinterprets the Japanese term he translates as falsehood. The word uso encompasses anything that is not strictly true, makoto, or factual, honto. As Lowell notes about Wordsworth's inability to distinguish between truth and fact, the average Japanese shares this tendency. For instance, if asked whether he dislikes someone or feels unwell, a Japanese, or even a refined American, might reply, "I like you very much," or "I am quite well, thank you," despite the reality being otherwise. Such responses are not meant to deceive, but to maintain harmony. However, to sacrifice truth solely for the sake of politeness was condemned by the samurai as an empty form, kyorei, or deception by sweet words. Thus far I have spoken about the Bushido perspective on veracity. It is worth addressing briefly the issue of commercial integrity, which has drawn significant criticism in foreign books and journals. It is true that lax business ethics have been a blemish on Japan's reputation. However, before condemning an entire nation for this failing, let us approach the subject with calm understanding. Such study may yield encouraging prospects for the future. Among all the great occupations in life, none was further removed from the profession of arms than commerce. Merchants were placed at the bottom of the social hierarchy, ranking below knights, farmers, and craftsmen. The samurai derived their income from the land and could, if they wished, engage in farming as a hobby. However, the counter and abacus were objects of disdain. This social arrangement was not without wisdom. Montesquieu noted that preventing the nobility from engaging in mercantile pursuits was an admirable policy, as it curbed the concentration of wealth in the hands of the powerful. By keeping power and wealth separate, resources were distributed more equitably. Similarly, Professor Dill, in Roman society in the last century of the Western Empire, reminds us that one cause of Rome's decline was allowing the nobility to engage in trade, leading to the accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of a small number of senatorial families. Under Japan's feudal system, commerce did not achieve the level of development it might have under freer conditions. The stigma attached to mercantile pursuits naturally drew to it those who cared little for social standing. As the saying goes, call one a thief and he will steal. When a profession is stigmatized, its practitioners often adjust their ethics to fit society's low expectations of them. Hugh Black aptly noted that the normal conscience rises to the demands made on it and easily falls to the limits of the standards expected from it. That said, no business, whether commercial or otherwise, can function without a code of ethics. During the feudal period, Japan's merchants developed their own moral code, which allowed them to lay the groundwork for vital mercantile institutions such as guilds, banks, stock exchanges, insurance, and systems of checks and bills of exchange. However, outside their professional circles, tradesmen often lived up to the negative reputation associated with their class. When Japan first opened its ports to foreign trade, it was the most daring and often the least scrupulous individuals who rushed to the ports. Meanwhile, the more reputable business houses hesitated to establish branches, despite repeated requests from the authorities. Was Bushido powerless to counteract the rising tide of commercial dishonor? Let us examine the situation. Not long after the treaty ports were opened, feudalism was abolished. The samurai, whose fiefs were taken, were compensated with government bonds and given the freedom to invest in mercantile ventures. One might wonder, why couldn't these noble warriors, with their much-lauded commitment to veracity, reform the corrupt practices of commerce? The answer lies in their tragic struggles. Many a noble and honest samurai entered the unfamiliar realm of trade and industry, only to fail spectacularly. Lacking the cunning and experience needed to compete with their shrewd, plebeian rivals, they were ill-equipped for success. For those with eyes to see and hearts to feel, the downfall of these honorable men was a source of deep sorrow. If in a country as industrialized as America, 80% of businesses fail, is it any surprise that fewer than 1 in 100 samurai succeeded in trade? The toll was immense. Fortunes were lost in the attempt to apply Bushido ethics to business, and it became painfully clear that the paths to wealth and honor were not the same. How, then, do they differ? Of the 3 incentives to veracity that Lecky identifies, the industrial, the political, and the philosophical, the first was entirely absent in Bushido. The second, political motivation, was underdeveloped in a feudal society. Honesty, therefore, was primarily cultivated in its philosophical form, which Lecky regards as its highest expression. With all my admiration for the commercial integrity of the Anglo-Saxon race, when I inquire about its ultimate foundation, the answer I often receive is, honesty is the best policy. In other words, it pays to be honest, but is virtue truly its own reward when it is practiced only for material gain? If honesty is valued merely because it yields more profit than deceit, then I fear Bushido would have preferred falsehood. Veracity and its connection to honor. If Bushido rejects the notion of quid pro quo rewards, the shrewder tradesman is quick to embrace it. Lecky has astutely observed that veracity owes much of its development to commerce and industry. Nietzsche, in turn, described honesty as the youngest of the virtues, suggesting it is a foster child of modern industrialization. Without this maternal influence, Veracity was like a noble orphan, dependent on the adoption and care of the most cultivated minds to survive. While such minds were abundant among the samurai, the lack of a more democratic and practical foster mother meant that this fragile virtue struggled to flourish. As industries advance, however, veracity becomes not only easier to practice, but also profitable. Consider that, as recently as November 1880, Bismarck issued a circular to German consuls warning of a lamentable lack of reliability in German shipments, both in terms of quality and quantity. Today, we rarely hear complaints about German dishonesty in trade. In just 20 years, German merchants learned that honesty ultimately pays. Likewise, Japanese merchants have begun to recognize this truth. For further insight, I direct the reader to recent works that explore this topic with measured judgment. It is worth noting that integrity and honor were once considered the best guarantees a debtor could offer. Promissory notes often included clauses like, "In the event that I fail to repay the loan, I will not object to being ridiculed in public," or, "If I cannot return the money, you may call me a fool." Such statements demonstrate how deeply tied honor was to personal and financial commitments. I have often wondered whether the veracity championed by Bushido stemmed from a higher moral imperative or was simply an extension of courage. Without a direct commandment against bearing false witness, lying was not condemned as a sin in Japan, but was instead denounced as a sign of weakness, and as such, highly dishonorable. Indeed, the very idea of honesty is so closely intertwined with honor that even the etymology of the words in Latin and German reflects this connection. It is fitting, then, to pause and reflect on how this relationship between honesty and honor shaped the precepts of knighthood. Chapter 8. Honor. The sense of honor, rooted in a profound awareness of personal dignity and worth, was an essential characteristic of the samurai. Born and raised to uphold the duties and privileges of their profession, they held honor as a guiding principle. Although the word commonly translated as honor today was not frequently used, the concept was expressed through terms like name, menmoku, countenance, and guaibun, outside hearing. These terms evoke ideas akin to the biblical use of name, the evolution of the term personality from the Greek mask, and the concept of fame. A good name, one's reputation described by Shakespeare as the immortal part of oneself, what remains being bestial, was assumed to be of utmost importance. Any blemish upon it was felt as shame, and the sense of shame, renchishin, was among the first lessons instilled in a samurai's education. Phrases such as, "You will be laughed at," "It will disgrace you," or "Are you not ashamed?" were the final appeals used to correct a child's misbehavior. These words struck the most sensitive chord in the young heart, as if the child had been nourished on honor since the womb. Indeed, honor is a prenatal influence, deeply intertwined with the consciousness of family solidarity. As Balzac observed, in losing the solidarity of families, society has lost the fundamental force which Montesquieu called honor. The sense of shame may well be the earliest indication of humanity's moral awakening. To my mind, the first and gravest consequence of eating the fruit of the forbidden tree was not the sorrow of childbirth, nor the curse of thorns and thistles, but the awakening of shame. Few moments in history rival the poignancy of the first mother, her chest heaving and fingers trembling, stitching together fig leaves that her dejected husband had plucked for her. This first result of disobedience clings to humanity with unmatched persistence. Despite all the sartorial ingenuity of humankind, we have yet to fashion an apron capable of concealing our sense of shame. The samurai who declared that he would not compromise his character for a minor humiliation in his youth was entirely right. As he explained, "Dishonor is like a scar on a tree. Time, far from erasing it, only helps it grow. Mencius, centuries before Carlyle, articulated the same truth. Shame is the soil of all virtue, of good manners and good morals. In samurai culture, the fear of disgrace loomed large, hanging like Damocles' sword over their heads. While our literature may lack the eloquence of Shakespeare's Norfolk, this fear often took on a morbid character. Under the banner of honor, actions were sometimes committed that defy justification under the Bushido code. At the slightest or even imagined insult, a quick-tempered samurai might draw his sword, sparking unnecessary conflict and tragic loss of life. There are stories, some too frivolous to believe, like that of a well-meaning citizen who pointed out a flea on a samurai's back, only to be cut down for the supposed insult of likening a warrior to a beast. Whether true or not, such tales reveal three important points. They were often invented to instill fear among common people. Abuses of the samurai's concept of honor did occur. A deeply ingrained sense of shame existed within the samurai class. It would be unfair, however, to condemn the principles of Bushido based on extreme cases, just as it would be unjust to judge Christianity by the excesses of inquisitions or hypocrisy. Yet, even in the morbid sensitivities surrounding samurai honor, one can glimpse the substratum of genuine virtue, much like the noble intentions underlying religious fervor, despite its occasional descent into fanaticism. To balance this extreme sensitivity, Bushido also emphasized magnanimity and patience. Taking offense at minor provocations was ridiculed as being short-tempered. A popular adage reminded samurai, "To bear what you think you cannot bear is true endurance." The great Tokugawa Ieyasu left behind timeless maxims that reflect this philosophy. The life of man is like going a long distance with a heavy load upon the shoulders. Do not hurry. Blame no one, but always remain mindful of your own shortcomings. Forbearance is the foundation of a long life. Ieyasu embodied these principles in his own life. A literary wit once characterized three famous figures in Japanese history with an epigram that captures their differing temperaments. To Oda Nobunaga he attributed, "I will kill her if the nightingale sings not in time." To Toyotomi Hideyoshi, "I will force her to sing for me." And to Tokugawa Ieyasu, "I will wait until she opens her lips." Patience and long-suffering were virtues highly esteemed by Mencius. In one of his writings he declares, "Though you strip me of my dignity and insult me, what is that to me? Your outrage cannot defile my soul." Elsewhere he teaches that while anger at petty offenses is beneath a superior man, righteous indignation for a noble cause is justified. The heights of unmartial meekness and unyielding patience that Bushido could inspire in its followers are evident in their words and deeds. Consider the wisdom of Ogawa. When others speak ill of you, do not repay evil with evil. Instead, reflect on whether you have been truly faithful in your duties. Kumazawa offered a similar sentiment. When others blame you, do not blame them in return. When others are angry with you, respond not with anger. Joy comes only when passion and desire depart. The teachings of Saigo Takamori, a man whose integrity was so profound that even shame would not dare sit upon his brow, also exemplify this philosophy. The way is the way of heaven and earth. Man's role is to follow it. Therefore, make it the purpose of your life to revere heaven. Heaven loves me and others equally. Thus, with the love you have for yourself, love others. Do not make man your partner, but make heaven your ally. And in partnership with heaven, do your best. Never condemn others. Instead, focus on not falling short of your own goals. These words, reminiscent of Christian teachings, demonstrate how deeply natural religion can align with revealed doctrines in practical morality. Importantly, these teachings were not mere platitudes. They were embodied in the lives and actions of Bushido's followers, serving as living testaments to their ideals. It must be acknowledged that few samurai reach the sublime heights of magnanimity, patience, and forgiveness. It is a regretful reality that there was no clear, universal understanding of what truly constitutes honor. Only a few enlightened minds grasped that honor rises from no condition and lies in fulfilling one's role with integrity. Too often, young samurai forgot the wisdom of Mencius in the heat of action. As the sage taught, all men desire honor, yet few realize that true honor lies within oneself and not elsewhere. Honor conferred by others is not genuine honor. Those whom Chao the Great ennobles, he can just as easily demean. In practice, insults were frequently met with swift and fatal retribution. Honor, often reduced to mere vainglory or public approval, was regarded as the ultimate goal of earthly existence. Fame, rather than wealth or knowledge, became the pinnacle of a samurai's ambition. Many young men vowed, as they crossed the threshold of their family homes, not to return until they had earned a name for themselves. Similarly, ambitious mothers would refuse to welcome their sons back unless they could return, as the saying goes, caparisoned in brocade. To avoid shame or achieve fame, samurai boys willingly endured severe hardships, both physical and mental. They understood that honor gained in youth would only grow with age. In the famous siege of Osaka, a young son of Tokugawa Ieyasu begged to be placed at the vanguard of the army, but was instead assigned to the rear. When the castle fell, he was inconsolable, weeping bitterly. An elderly counselor attempted to comfort him, saying, "Take heart, my lord. You have a long future ahead of you. In the years to come, you will find many opportunities to prove your worth." The boy fixed an indignant gaze on the man and replied, "How foolishly you speak! Can my 14th year ever come again?" For the samurai, life itself was considered cheap if honor or fame could be won through its sacrifice. Whenever a cause arose that was deemed more valuable than life, samurai would lay down their lives with remarkable serenity and speed. Among such causes, none was held in higher regard than the duty of loyalty. Loyalty was the keystone that transformed the virtues of feudalism into a harmonious and symmetrical arch. Chapter 9. The Duty of Loyalty. Feudal morality shares many virtues with other ethical systems and social classes, but loyalty, homage and fealty to a superior is its hallmark. While personal fidelity exists in all walks of life, even a gang of pickpockets may show allegiance to their leader. Only in the code of chivalry does loyalty take on supreme importance. Hegel once criticized the fidelity of feudal vassals, arguing that their obligation to an individual rather than to a commonwealth was inherently unjust. Yet, a great compatriot of his, Bismarck, took pride in claiming personal loyalty as a German virtue. He was justified in doing so, not because loyalty was unique to Germany, but because this prized fruit of chivalry lingers longest among those whose societies have retained feudal traditions. In America, where everybody is as good as anybody else, and, as the Irishman humorously added, better too, the lofty loyalty we feel toward our sovereign may seem admirable within limits, but excessive or even absurd when observed in our context. Montesquieu long ago remarked that what is considered right on one side of the Pyrenees might be seen as wrong on the other. The infamous Dreyfus trial highlighted the truth of this observation, not because the Pyrenees are the sole boundary where justice diverges, but because such disparities in values exist across nations. Similarly, our conception of loyalty may find few admirers elsewhere, not because it is inherently flawed, but because it is perhaps forgotten in other cultures. Moreover, we elevate loyalty to heights rarely seen elsewhere. Griffiths correctly observed that while Confucian ethics in China prioritized filial piety as the primary human duty, in Japan, loyalty took precedence. At the risk of surprising some readers, let me share a tale of one who could endure to follow a fallen lord, thus earning, as Shakespeare assures us, a place in the story. This story is about Michizane, one of the most revered figures in Japanese history. After falling victim to jealousy and slander, he was exiled from the capital. However, his enemies were not satisfied with his banishment. They sought to extinguish his entire family. Their search for his young son led them to a small village school run by Genzo, a former vassal of Michizane. When Genzo receives an order to deliver the boy's head by a certain date, he faces a harrowing decision. Scanning his class roster, he meticulously observes each child entering the classroom. But none of the local boys bear any resemblance to Michizane's son. Just as despair begins to overwhelm him, a new student arrives. A boy of the same age, escorted by a mother of noble bearing. The resemblance between this new pupil and the young lord is striking, and both mother and child are painfully aware of it. In private, the mother and son have already resolved to sacrifice themselves. The boy offers his life, and the mother her heart, all without revealing their plans to the outside world. Unaware of this, Genzo is the one who proposes the substitution. Thus, a scapegoat is found. On the appointed day, the officer arrives to confirm the identity of the head. Will the deception work? Genzo, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword, prepares to act, whether to strike the officer or himself, if the plan fails. The officer inspects the head closely, examining each feature with a calm and businesslike demeanor, before declaring it genuine. That evening, in a lonely home, the noble mother waits, her eyes fixed on the gate. She knows her son will not return. Her father-in-law had long been a beneficiary of Michizane's generosity, but after the exile, her husband was compelled to serve the enemy who sought to destroy Michizane's family. Bound by loyalty to his new master, the husband could not act against him. However, his son could serve the cause of their former lord. It was the husband himself, entrusted with the gruesome task of identifying the head, who ensured the boy's sacrifice was not in vain. Now, as he returns home after the day's, and indeed life's, most agonizing work, he greets his wife with these words, "Rejoice, my wife, our beloved son has proven himself of service to his lord." What an atrocious story, I hear my readers exclaim, parents deliberately sacrificing their innocent child to save another man's life. Yet this child was no unwitting victim. He was conscious of his role and willingly offered himself. It is a tale of vicarious sacrifice, significant and no more shocking than the biblical story of Abraham's intended sacrifice of Isaac. In both instances, obedience to the call of duty and absolute submission to a higher command, whether from a visible angel or an inner voice, were at the heart of the act. But I will refrain from preaching further. Western individualism, which recognizes separate interests for father and son, husband and wife, naturally emphasizes the duties they owe one another. However, Bushido viewed the family as a unified entity, its interests inseparable. This unity was intertwined with a natural, instinctive, and irresistible affection. To die for someone we love with such innate affection is admirable, but not extraordinary. As the Christian teaching reminds us, if ye love them that love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? In his great historical work, Sanyo poignantly recounts the inner torment of Shigemori as he struggled with his father's rebellious actions. If I am loyal to my sovereign, my father will be ruined. But if I obey my father, I will fail in my duty to my sovereign. Shigemori, torn between his obligations, fervently prayed for death, beseeching heaven to release him from a world where purity and righteousness could not coexist. Many samurai, like Shigemori, endured profound anguish as they navigated conflicts between duty and affection. Neither Shakespeare's works, nor even the Old Testament, offers a parallel to the depth of Ko, the Japanese conception of filial piety. Yet, in such moments of crisis, Bushido never faltered in its ultimate allegiance to loyalty. Women, too, upheld this ideal with remarkable resolve. Like Widow Wyndham and her illustrious consort, samurai mothers stood steadfast, urging their sons to sacrifice everything for the cause of loyalty. They were unwavering in their commitment, ready to give up their children for the sake of duty and honor. Like Aristotle and some modern sociologists, Bushido conceived of the state as predating the individual. The individual was born into the state, not separate from it, and existed as an integral part of the whole. As such, a person's life and death were to be devoted to the state or to its legitimate authority. Readers of Plato's Crito may recall Socrates' depiction of the city's laws, pleading with him about his potential escape. The laws argue, since you were begotten, nurtured, and educated under us, dare you claim you are not our offspring and servant, as were your ancestors before you? Such words might not strike us as particularly remarkable, for a similar sentiment has long been part of Bushido. However, there is a distinction. In the Japanese tradition, the laws and the state were often personified, represented by a legitimate ruler or authority. Loyalty, then, is an ethical expression of this political theory. I'm not unaware of Herbert Spencer's perspective, which suggests that political obedience, loyalty, may serve only a transitional role in the evolution of society. This may indeed be the case. Yet, as the proverb reminds us, sufficient unto the day is the virtue thereof. In Japan, we hold this principle close, especially given our belief that this day may span a vast expanse of time, during which, as our national anthem poetically declares, tiny pebbles grow into mighty rocks draped with moss. Even among democratic nations like England, the sentiment of personal fidelity endures. As Monsieur Bumi noted, the loyalty their Germanic ancestors felt for their chiefs and their descendants has gradually transformed into a profound devotion to the race and bloodline of their monarchs, evidenced by their extraordinary attachment to the dynasty. Herbert Spencer predicted that political subordination would eventually give way to loyalty to the dictates of conscience. If this vision comes to pass, will loyalty and the accompanying instinct of reverence vanish forever? Not necessarily. Allegiance can shift from one master to another without betrayal. We may transition from serving a ruler who wields temporal power to serving a monarch who resides within the sanctuary of our hearts. A few years ago, a rather misguided controversy emerged in Japan, fueled by overzealous followers of Spencer. In their fervor to defend the throne's claim to undivided loyalty, they accused Christians of treason for professing allegiance to their lord and master. Their arguments, dressed in pseudo-logical garb, lacked the wit of true sophists or the precision of medieval scholastics. What they failed to grasp is that one can indeed serve two masters without holding to one or despising the other, as long as we render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Socrates provides a powerful example of this dual allegiance. While he steadfastly refused to compromise his loyalty to his inner voice, his daemon, he simultaneously obeyed the laws of the state with unwavering fidelity. He followed his conscience in life and served his country in death. What a grim day it would be if a state ever grew so powerful as to demand the submission of its citizens' consciences. Bushido never required such a sacrifice. It did not demand that we make our conscience the slave of any ruler or king. In this, Thomas Mowbray, from Shakespeare's Richard II, could well have spoken for the samurai spirit when he declared, "Myself I throw, dread sovereign, at thy foot. My life thou shalt command, but not my shame, the one my duty owes, but my fair name, despite of death, that lives upon my grave, to dark dishonour's use, thou shalt not have. For a man to surrender his conscience to another's will would be to betray his very essence. In the philosophy of Bushido, the capricious whims or arbitrary desires of a sovereign were held in low regard. A ruler who demanded blind servitude or indulged in frivolous commands was treated with disdain. Those who complied through sycophancy were scorned as nation, cringing flatterers who sought favour through unprincipled fawning, or as Choshin favourites who secured their master's affections through servile compliance. These two types of subjects find their counterparts in Iago's description from Othello. 1. A duteous and knee-crooking knave, doting on his own obsequious bondage, wearing out his time much like his master's ass. The other, trimming in forms and visages of duty, keeping yet his heart attending on himself. When a samurai disagreed with his master, the proper course was not silent obedience, but earnest persuasion. Like Kent in King Lear, he was expected to use every means at his disposal to convince his lord of his error. If these efforts failed, it was the lord's prerogative to decide the samurai's fate. In such cases, it was not uncommon for the samurai to make a final appeal to his master's intelligence and conscience by demonstrating the sincerity of his words with the ultimate sacrifice, his own life. For the samurai, life was not an end in itself, but a means to serve his master. His existence was devoted to the pursuit of honor. Consequently, every aspect of his education and training was designed to align with this ideal. Chapter 10. The Education and Training of a Samurai. The foundation of samurai education rested on the cultivation of character, prioritizing moral strength over the subtler faculties of prudence, intelligence, and rhetorical skill. While aesthetic accomplishments played an important role in their upbringing, they were regarded as accessories rather than the core of a samurai's training. Intellectual prowess was valued, but the term chi, used to denote intellect, primarily referred to wisdom, with mere knowledge holding a subordinate place. The framework of Bushido rested on three pillars: chi, wisdom; jin, benevolence; and yu, courage. A samurai was, above all, a man of action. Science, though recognized, was valued only insofar as it served his profession as a warrior. Religion and theology were left to priests, and a samurai concerned himself with them only as sources of strength and courage. In the spirit of the English poet, he believed, "'Tis not the creed that saves the man, but it is the man that justifies the creed." Philosophy and literature formed the intellectual backbone of a samurai's education. However, his pursuit of these disciplines was not driven by a quest for objective truth. Literature was enjoyed as a pastime, while philosophy served as a practical tool for shaping character and solving military or political problems. Given this approach, the samurai's curriculum included the following disciplines: fencing, archery, jiu-jitsu or yawara, horsemanship, spear combat, tactics, calligraphy, ethics, literature, and history. Two of these, jiu-jitsu and calligraphy, deserve special mention. Calligraphy. Great emphasis was placed on beautiful handwriting. Japanese logograms, which combine elements of art and meaning, were seen as a reflection of one's personal character. Mastery of calligraphy was not only a skill, but also a testament to the refinement of a samurai's inner self. Jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu can be described as the application of anatomical knowledge for offensive or defensive purposes. Unlike wrestling, it does not rely on brute strength, nor does it employ weapons. The art lies in targeting specific parts of the opponent's body to render them temporarily numb or incapable of resistance. The aim is not to kill, but to incapacitate, ensuring that the opponent cannot fight back for the time being. Mathematics, a subject one might expect in military education, was notably absent from the training of a samurai. This absence can be partly explained by the lack of scientific precision in feudal warfare. More importantly, the entire samurai ethos was fundamentally incompatible with fostering numerical or monetary concerns. Chivalry, by its very nature, disdains wealth and embraces simplicity, even poverty. It resonates with Ventidius's claim, ambition, the soldier's virtue, rather makes choice of loss than gain, which darkens him. Like Don Quixote, who took pride in his battered spear and emaciated horse rather than in riches, the samurai shared this disregard for material wealth. To them, money was truly filthy lucre. A well-worn saying described the decline of an era as, "The civilians loved money, and the soldiers feared death." Stinginess with either gold or life was despised, just as generosity in both was celebrated. A common precept warned, "Less than all things men must grudge money. It is by riches that wisdom is hindered." Children were raised without concern for economy. Speaking of money was considered vulgar, and ignorance of coin values was a mark of refinement. While knowledge of numbers was necessary for organizing troops and managing land or resources, tasks like counting money were delegated to lower-ranking samurai or priests. Public finances in many domains were often handled by those deemed of lesser social standing. Though samurai understood that money was essential for waging war, they never elevated its accumulation to a virtue. Thrift, as encouraged by Bushido, was not rooted in financial prudence, but rather in self-discipline and abstinence. Luxury was regarded as the greatest threat to a warrior's strength of character, and simplicity in lifestyle was strictly enforced through sumptuary laws in many clans. A samurai's worth lay not in wealth, but in his honor and adherence to the principles of his code. In ancient Rome, financial agents and revenue collectors were gradually elevated to the rank of knights, reflecting the state's recognition of their service and the increasing importance of money. This shift was closely tied to the luxury and greed that permeated Roman society. The precepts of knighthood, however, steadfastly maintained that finance was inherently low when compared to moral and intellectual pursuits. By deliberately ignoring money and the love of it, Bushido shielded itself from the countless evils that wealth often breeds. For a long time, this approach ensured that public officials remained largely free from corruption. Unfortunately, in our time, we witness the rapid encroachment of plutocracy, threatening the values once safeguarded by these precepts. Mental discipline, which in modern times might be fostered through the study of mathematics, was cultivated in the samurai through literary analysis and discussions on ethics and duty. Abstract subjects rarely occupied the minds of the young, as the primary goal of their education was to develop decisiveness of character. Simply possessing a wealth of information garnered little admiration. As Bacon categorizes the purposes of learning for delight, ornament, and ability, Bushido clearly prioritized ability, valuing education that was practical, aiding in judgment and the effective management of affairs. Whether it was for the administration of public duties or the cultivation of self-control, education under Bushido was always directed toward a practical outcome. As Confucius wisely noted, "Learning without thought is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous." When a teacher focuses on shaping character rather than merely imparting intelligence, and when the soul rather than the intellect becomes the material to nurture, their vocation assumes a sacred quality. As the saying goes, "It is the parent who has borne me, it is the teacher who makes me man." With this belief, teachers were held in the highest esteem. Such reverence could only be inspired by a person of superior character and knowledge, someone who served as both a guide and a guardian. A teacher was seen as a father to the fatherless and a counselor to those who had strayed. As one of our maxims states, "Thy father and thy mother are like heaven and earth. Thy teacher and thy Lord are like the sun and moon. The current system of paying for all forms of service did not align with the principles of Bushido. It upheld the idea of service given freely, without monetary compensation. Spiritual service, whether offered by a teacher or a priest, was not to be repaid in gold or silver, not because it lacked value, but because it was beyond valuation. Here, the non-materialistic ethos of Bushido offers a deeper truth than modern political economy. Wages can only be paid for services with measurable, tangible outcomes. In contrast, the most valuable contribution in education, the cultivation of the soul, is neither tangible nor measurable. Because its value defies measurement, money, the supposed measure of value, becomes irrelevant. Tradition allowed students to present their teachers with offerings, often in the form of money or goods, at various times of the year. However, these were not payments, but tokens of respect and gratitude. Teachers, often men of austere dignity, lived with an honorable poverty, too proud to beg and too dignified to engage in manual labor. They embodied resilience and high ideals, showing unwavering strength in the face of adversity. These educators were living examples of the ultimate goal of all learning: self-control. This discipline of disciplines was a quality universally demanded of the samurai. Chapter 11. Self-control. The discipline of fortitude, which demanded endurance without complaint, combined with the teachings of politeness, which instructed one to avoid disrupting the peace or comfort of others with personal sorrow or pain, fostered a stoic mindset among the samurai. Over time, this developed into what appeared to be a national trait of Stoicism. I say apparent Stoicism because I do not believe true Stoicism can define an entire people. Moreover, certain Japanese customs may seem to a foreign observer as overly harsh or unfeeling. Yet, beneath this exterior, we are as capable of tender emotion as any other race. In some ways, we may even feel more deeply than others, precisely because the effort to suppress natural emotions brings its own suffering. Imagine children, both boys and girls, raised to avoid shedding tears or voicing their pain for emotional relief. There is a physiological question as to whether such restraint strengthens their nerves or makes them more sensitive. For a samurai, it was considered unmanly to display emotions openly. A great character was described as one who shows no sign of joy or anger. Even the most natural affections were held in check. A father might embrace his son, but only at the cost of his dignity. A husband would not kiss his wife in public, whatever he might do in private. A witty young man once remarked, "American husbands kiss their wives in public and beat them in private, while Japanese husbands beat their wives in public and kiss them in private." Calmness of demeanor and composure of mind were to remain undisturbed by any passion. During the war with China, when a regiment was departing from a town, a large crowd gathered at the station to bid farewell to the general and his soldiers. Among the spectators was an American resident who came expecting to witness loud, emotional farewells, given the nation's excitement and the presence of fathers, mothers, wives, and sweethearts in the crowd. The American observer was deeply puzzled. As the train's whistle blew and it began to move, thousands of hats were silently removed, and heads bowed in solemn reverence. There was no waving of handkerchiefs, no shouts of farewell, just a profound silence, broken only by the faint sound of a few stifled sobs. In domestic life, this same stoic restraint prevailed. I recall a father who spent entire nights standing silently behind a door, listening to the breathing of his sick child, unwilling to be caught in an act of what he considered parental weakness. And there was a mother who, on her deathbed, refrained from calling for her son, fearing to disrupt his studies. Our history and daily life abound with such examples of quiet heroism. Many of our women, steadfast and selfless, could stand shoulder to shoulder with the heroines of Plutarch's pages. Among the peasantry, a writer like Ian McLaren would undoubtedly discover countless characters as moving as Margaret Howe. This discipline of self-restraint also explains why Christian revivals are less frequent in Japan than in the West. When a man or woman feels their soul stirred, the instinct is not to express it outwardly, but to suppress it inwardly. Only on rare occasions, when moved by an unstoppable force, does one speak with eloquence born of sincerity. To openly discuss spiritual experiences in a casual or public setting, especially in a way that risks trivializing them, is unsettling to the Japanese ear. The sacred is not to be spoken of lightly. A young samurai once wrote in his diary, "If the soil of your soul is stirred by tender thoughts, it is the season for seeds to grow. Do not disturb it with speech, but let it work quietly and in secrecy." For many, voicing profound inner feelings, especially those of a spiritual nature, is seen as a sign that they are neither deep nor genuine. A popular saying likens such a person to a pomegranate. When they open their mouth, they reveal everything inside their heart. This tendency to guard one's emotions is not mere obstinacy. The moment we feel moved, we instinctively shield our lips, preferring to conceal our thoughts. Speech, as a Frenchman once said, can be the art of concealing thought. Visit a Japanese friend in a time of deep sorrow, and you will likely be greeted with laughter, though their eyes are red or their cheeks damp with tears. At first, this might seem hysterical, but when pressed, they may respond with simple phrases like, "Life is full of sorrow," or "All who meet must part," or "He who is born must die." Such words are reminders of an ancient wisdom that resonates deeply in Japan. Long before the noble Hohenzollern spoke the phrase, "Learn to suffer without complaint," its spirit had already found a home in our hearts. The Japanese often turn to laughter when human frailty is tested to its limits. Perhaps we have an even stronger reason for this tendency than Democritus himself, for in our case, laughter frequently serves as a way to restore balance when emotions are disturbed by sorrow or rage. It acts as a counterweight to such feelings, helping us regain composure. Since the suppression of emotions is so deeply ingrained in our culture, we often find a release through poetic expression. A poet from the 10th century once wrote, "In Japan and China alike, when sorrow stirs humanity, grief is poured into verse." Another poet, mourning the loss of her child, tried to console herself by imagining him chasing dragonflies as he used to. She softly sang, "How far today in chase, I wonder, has gone my hunter of the dragonfly." I hesitate to share more examples, as translating these poetic gems into a foreign tongue could never do justice to their delicate beauty. These verses, born of bleeding hearts, are strung like rare and precious beads in our literary heritage. I hope, however, that I have managed to reveal some of the inner workings of our minds, a complexity that can sometimes seem cold or hysterically fluctuating between laughter and sorrow, even leading some to question our sanity. It has also been suggested that our tolerance for pain and indifference to death stem from less sensitive nerves. This theory may sound plausible, but it raises another question. Why are our nerves less tightly strung? Perhaps it is due to our less stimulating climate, or maybe our monarchical government does not stir us as much as a republic excites the French. Or perhaps we do not immerse ourselves in works like Sartor Resartus with the same fervor as the English. Personally, I believe that our excitability and sensitivity made it necessary to develop and enforce self-repression. Still, whatever the explanation, no theory is complete without accounting for the long years of discipline in self-control that shaped us. Of course, discipline in self-control can be taken too far. It can stifle the soul's natural warmth, twisting pliable spirits into distortions and even monstrosities. It can lead to bigotry, hypocrisy, or a dulling of human affections. Every virtue, no matter how noble, has its shadow and its counterfeit. To fully embrace self-restraint, we must recognize its true excellence and strive for its ideal, what we call keeping a level mind. To borrow a Greek term, this is the state of euthymia, which Democritus regarded as the highest good. The pinnacle of self-control is perhaps best demonstrated in two institutions we will now discuss: the practice of suicide and the concept of redress. Chapter 12. The institutions of suicide and redress. Of these two practices, harakiri, ritual suicide, and katakiyuchi, vengeance or redress, many foreign writers have written with varying depth. Let us begin with seppuku, also known colloquially as harakiri, which refers to self-immolation by disembowelment. Ripping the abdomen, how absurd! This may be the first reaction of those unfamiliar with the term. Yet, odd as it might sound to foreign ears, it is not so alien to those acquainted with Western literature. Consider Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where Brutus declares, "Thy Caesar's spirit walks abroad and turns our swords into our proper entrails." Or think of Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia, where he describes a sword piercing the bowels of a queen. Neither of these examples invites ridicule for their language or the imagery they evoke. If we turn to visual art, Guercino's painting of Cato's death, displayed in the Palazzo Rossa in Genoa, vividly depicts this form of self-inflicted death. Readers of Addison's play, Cato will recall the poignant swan song that the titular character sings as he chooses this act. These examples demonstrate that, when tied to noble deeds or profound sacrifice, this mode of death loses its grotesque connotations and instead gains dignity, even reverence. To us, seppuku carries a similar weight. It is associated with acts of great valor, deep loyalty, and heart-rending pathos. Through the transformative power of virtue, greatness, and tenderness, even the most harrowing acts can transcend their brutality. They become symbols of rebirth, honor, or ultimate resolution. Consider the cross, which was once an instrument of shame and death, but became a sign that inspired a world. Not only does seppuku lose its absurdity for us due to its cultural associations, but the choice of the abdomen as the site of the act is deeply rooted in an ancient anatomical belief. It was thought to be the seat of the soul and emotions. When Moses wrote of Joseph's bowels yearning upon his brother, or David prayed to the Lord not to forget his bowels, or when Isaiah and Jeremiah described the sounding or troubling of bowels, they were reflecting a similar belief that emotions and spirit were housed in the abdomen. The Semites often spoke of the liver, kidneys, and the surrounding fat as the dwelling places of life and emotion. The Japanese term hara is even more encompassing than the Greek phren or thumos, and both the Japanese and the ancient Greeks believed the spirit of a person resided in this area of the body. This notion is not unique to antiquity. Even in modern times, the French used terms like ventre, belly, in ways that, while anatomically vague, are physiologically meaningful. Similarly, entrailles in French represents affection and compassion. This belief is not mere superstition. It aligns more closely with scientific insights than the common idea of the heart as the center of feelings. Without needing to consult a friar, the Japanese intuitively understood better than Romeo in what vile part of this anatomy one's name did lodge. Modern neurology supports this idea with its acknowledgement of the abdominal and pelvic brains, referring to sympathetic nerve centers in these regions that react strongly to emotional and psychological stimuli. Once this understanding of mental physiology is accepted, the rationale behind seppuku becomes clear. I will open the seat of my soul and show you its state. See for yourself whether it is clean or polluted. I do not suggest that seppuku has religious or even moral justification. Instead, the overwhelming value placed on personal honor often served as reason enough for taking one's life. Many accepted the sentiment expressed by Garth. When honor's lost, 'tis a relief to die, death's but a sure retreat from infamy. And so many samurai smilingly surrendered their souls to oblivion. In Bushido, death, when tied to a question of honor, was often seen as the key to resolving complex dilemmas. To an ambitious samurai, a natural and uneventful death could seem almost lackluster, a conclusion not to be eagerly sought. Even many good Christians, if they were honest, might admit a certain fascination with, if not outright admiration for, the sublime calm with which figures like Cato, Brutus, Petronius, and other ancient dignitaries chose to end their own lives. Is it too bold to suggest that even the death of Socrates, the father of philosophy, carried elements of suicide? His disciples tell us in great detail how Socrates willingly submitted to the state's unjust verdict. Despite opportunities to escape, he took the cup of hemlock in his own hand and even offered a libation from its deadly contents. Was his conduct not an act of self-sacrifice? There was no physical force compelling him, as there would be in a typical execution. The verdict simply stated, "Thou shalt die, and by thine own hand." If suicide means nothing more than dying by one's own hand, then Socrates fits the description. Yet no one accuses him of committing a crime. Plato, who strongly opposed suicide, never once called his master a suicide. Now, with this understanding, we can see that seppuku was far more than mere self-inflicted death. It was a deeply institutionalized practice, steeped in legal and ceremonial significance. Emerging during the medieval era, seppuku became a way for warriors to expiate their crimes, apologize for mistakes, escape disgrace, redeem a friend's honor, or demonstrate the sincerity of their convictions. When practiced as a legal punishment, seppuku followed a strict and solemn ceremonial process. It was a refined act of self-destruction, demanding the utmost composure and courage, making it a ritual uniquely suited to the warrior class. Out of a sense of both antiquarian curiosity and respect for this now obsolete practice, I am tempted to provide a detailed description of the ceremony. However, such a description has already been eloquently recorded by a far more capable writer. Algernon Bertram Mitford, in his Tales of Old Japan, offers a fascinating translation of a rare Japanese manuscript on the subject. He also recounts a first-hand account of a seppuku ceremony he witnessed. Allow me to share his words with you. We, a group of 7 foreign representatives, were invited to join the Japanese witnesses in the Hondo, the main hall of the temple, where the ceremony was to take place. The scene was both solemn and awe-inspiring. The hall was vast, with a high roof supported by dark wooden pillars. From the ceiling hung a striking array of massive gilt lamps and ornaments characteristic of Buddhist temples. At the front, near the high altar, the floor was covered in immaculate white mats, slightly raised 3 or 4 inches above the ground. At the center lay a scarlet felt rug, vividly contrasting with the muted tones of the room. Tall candles, evenly spaced, cast a dim, mysterious glow, just enough to illuminate the proceedings. The 7 Japanese officials sat on the left side of the raised floor, while we foreigners were seated to the right. No other spectators were present, adding to the heavy atmosphere of anticipation. After a few tense moments, Taki Zenzaburo entered the hall. He was a tall, strong man of 32, with an air of nobility about him. He wore the formal attire reserved for such solemn occasions, including the distinctive hempen cloth wings that are donned during ceremonial events. He was accompanied by a kaishaku, an assistant or second, and 3 officers who wore jinbaori, the ornate war surcoats lined with gold fabric. It's worth explaining the role of the kaishaku. The term does not translate well into English, as it is far from what we would call an executioner. In fact, the position was one of honor and trust. In many cases, the kaishaku would be a close friend or relative of the condemned, acting as a second rather than a mere executioner. In this case, the kaishaku was a student of Taki Zenzaburo, chosen by mutual friends for his exceptional skill in swordsmanship. With the kaishaku at his left side, Taki Zenzaburo moved forward with deliberate steps toward the Japanese witnesses. The two bowed deeply before them, then turned toward us foreigners and offered the same salutation, perhaps with an added touch of deference. In each instance, the bow was returned with equal salute. With measured grace and dignity, Taki Zenzaburo stepped onto the raised platform, prostrated himself twice before the high altar, and seated himself on the scarlet felt carpet, his back to the altar. The kaishaku took his position, crouching quietly on Zenzaburo's left side. One of the three attending officers approached, carrying a small ceremonial stand like those used in temples for offerings. Resting atop the stand, wrapped in pristine white paper, was the wakizashi, a short Japanese sword, its 9.5-inch blade honed to a razor's edge. The officer knelt and presented the stand, bowing low. Taki Zenzaburo received the weapon reverently, lifting it to his head with both hands before carefully placing it in front of him. After one more profound bow, Zenzaburo began to speak. His voice carried a hint of emotion and hesitation, as one might expect from a man making a final confession, yet his face and demeanor remained composed and unflinching. "I and I alone," he declared, "gave the unwarranted order to fire upon the foreigners at Kobe, and again as they attempted to flee. For this crime, I now take my own life. I humbly ask you who are present to do me the honor of witnessing this act." Bowing once more, Taki Zenzaburo allowed his upper garments to slip down to his girdle, leaving his torso bare. With careful precision, he tucked his sleeves under his knees to ensure he would not fall backward. A noble samurai must die falling forward. Deliberately and with a steady hand, he reached for the wakizashi resting before him. He gazed at the blade wistfully, almost with affection, as though contemplating its significance. For a moment, he seemed to gather his final thoughts. Then, with resolute purpose, he plunged the blade deeply into his left side, just below the waist. Slowly, he drew the blade across to the right, and with a turn of the blade, he made a slight upward cut. Throughout this excruciatingly painful act, his face remained impassive, betraying no sign of suffering. When he finally withdrew the blade, his body leaned forward as his neck stretched out. For the first time, a faint expression of pain crossed his face, but he made no sound. At that moment, the kaishaku, who had been crouching intently by his side and watching every movement, sprang to his feet. In one fluid motion, he raised his sword high, paused momentarily, and then brought it down with a swift, decisive stroke. There was a flash of steel, followed by a heavy thud as the head was cleanly severed from the body. A profound silence followed, broken only by the grotesque sound of blood pulsing from the lifeless body, a chilling reminder that moments ago it had been a brave and honorable man. The kaishaku made a low bow, carefully wiped his blade with a piece of prepared paper, and stepped away. The blood-stained wakizashi was solemnly removed, serving as proof of the execution. The two officials representing the Mikado then approached the foreign witnesses, bowed respectfully, and declared that the sentence of death on Taki Zenzaburo had been carried out faithfully. With the ceremony concluded, we left the temple, the image of that grim scene etched indelibly into our minds. When they were all seated in a row for their final act, Sakon turned to the youngest and said, "Go first, so that I can be certain you perform it correctly." The youngest, replying with childlike calmness, said, "Since I have never seen seppuku performed, I would like to watch both of you first, and then I will follow." At this, the older brothers smiled, even through their tears. "Well said, little one. You can truly boast of being our father's son." They placed him between them, and Sakon, taking the lead, thrust the dagger into the left side of his abdomen. Turning to his younger brother, he explained, "Watch closely. Do you see now? Just be careful not to push the dagger too far in, or you might fall backward. Lean forward instead, and keep your knees steady." Nike followed, demonstrating with the same deliberate composure, adding, "Keep your eyes open, little one, or you'll look like a dying woman. If the dagger feels resistance and your strength falters, summon courage and double your effort to cut across." The boy, wide-eyed, looked from one brother to the other, taking in their every movement. When both had passed, he calmly removed his upper garments, just as they had done, and with steady resolve followed their example. This stark portrayal of familial loyalty and sacrifice shows the profound hold the concept of seppuku had on the samurai ethos. Yet, as the passage later reflects, such glorification often led to unwarranted acts of self-destruction. The glorification of seppuku naturally tempted many to commit it without just cause. Reckless youths, driven by reasons that defied logic or lacked gravity, rushed toward it, like moths drawn to a flame. For some, mixed or uncertain motives spurred their actions, leading more samurai to this fate than nuns to convent gates. Life was cheap by the prevailing standards of honor. The tragic irony lay in the fact that honor, held in such high regard, was not always pure gold, but often alloyed with baser motives. One can only imagine that the seventh circle of Dante's Inferno, reserved for those who end their own lives, would teem with the souls of countless Japanese. And yet, for a true samurai to hasten death or court, it was nothing short of cowardice. Consider the story of a warrior who, after losing battle after battle, found himself alone in the hollow of a tree. Hungry, exhausted, his sword dull from overuse, his bow broken, and his arrows spent. What could he do? Did he, like the Romans at Philippi, fall upon his own sword? No. Instead, summoning fortitude akin to a martyr's, he composed this verse. "Come, evermore come, ye dread sorrows and pains, and heap upon my burdened back, that I not one test may lack of what strength in me remains." This was the essence of Bushido's teaching: face all calamities and adversities with patience and a clear conscience. As Mencius taught, when heaven is about to confer a great office on someone, it first exercises their mind with suffering and their sinews and bones with toil. It exposes their body to hunger, subjects them to extreme poverty, and confounds their undertakings. In all these ways, it stimulates their mind, hardens their nature, and compensates for their shortcomings. True honor, then, lies in fulfilling heaven's decree. No death encountered in carrying out that divine purpose is dishonorable, but to die simply to avoid what heaven has in store, now that is cowardice. Consider the words of Sir Thomas Browne in his Religio Medici, a passage that aligns closely with our precepts. "It is a brave act of valor to contemn death, but where life is more terrible than death, it is then the truest valor to dare to live." A renowned priest of the 17th century once remarked with a touch of satire, "Talk as he may, a samurai who has never faced death is likely to flee or hide when the moment of decision comes." And yet, it was also said, "He who has died once in his heart, deep within his breast, can never be pierced by the spears of Sanada or the arrows of Tametomo." How near these ideas bring us to the threshold of another teaching, one from the temple built by him who said, "He that loseth his life for my sake shall find it." These examples only underscore the shared moral fabric of humanity, despite the efforts of some to draw a vast chasm between what is Christian and what is considered pagan. We have now seen that the Bushido practice of suicide, or seppuku, was neither as irrational nor as barbaric as its misuse might suggest at first glance. Let us now turn to its sister practice, redress, or, if you prefer, revenge. Does it too have redeeming features? This question need not detain us long, for a similar custom has existed among nearly all peoples and remains not entirely obsolete. The persistence of practices like dueling and lynching offers clear evidence. Even in recent times, we have witnessed incidents like an American officer challenging Esterhazy in defense of Dreyfus's honor. Among primitive tribes without formal marriage customs, adultery may not be considered a sin. It is only a lover's jealousy that protects a woman from abuse. Likewise, in societies without criminal courts, murder is not classified as a crime. Only the vigilant vengeance of the victim's kin ensures social order. "What is the most beautiful thing on earth?" Osiris once asked Horus. The reply was, "To avenge a parent's wrongs." To this, a Japanese might have added, "and a master's." There is something deeply instinctive in revenge that satisfies our innate sense of justice. The reasoning goes like this: my father did not deserve to die. The man who killed him committed a great evil. If my father were alive, he would not tolerate such a deed. Heaven itself despises wrongdoing. Therefore, it is the will of my father and the will of heaven that this wrong be corrected. The wrongdoer must pay for his crime, and I, his son and flesh, must carry out justice. We cannot both live under the same sky. Though simple and childlike in logic, this reasoning reflects an instinctive desire for balance and justice. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Until the equation is balanced, the feeling of something left undone lingers. In the traditions of Judaism, with its belief in a jealous God, or in Greek mythology, with its avenging nemesis, vengeance might be left to superhuman forces. But in Bushido, common sense shaped the concept of redress into a kind of ethical court, where justice could be sought for wrongs that formal law could not address. Consider the story of the 47 Ronin. Their master was unjustly condemned to death, and no higher court existed to hear his appeal. His loyal retainers took up the mantle of vengeance, their only remaining path to justice. Though their actions broke the law of the land, the instinct of the people rendered a different judgment. Their graves at Sengakuji remain honored and fragrant to this day, preserving their memory as a testament to their loyalty and their sense of justice. Although Lao Tse taught the principle of repaying injury with kindness, Confucius' louder voice declared that injury must be repaid with justice. Yet even within this framework, revenge was justified only when undertaken for the sake of one's superiors or benefactors. Personal wrongs, including injuries to one's wife and children, were to be endured and forgiven. A samurai could admire Hannibal's vow to avenge his country's wrongs, but would scorn James Hamilton, who carried a handful of earth from his wife's grave in his girdle as an eternal reminder to seek vengeance on Regent Murray for her death. Both the institutions of suicide, seppuku, and redress, katakeuchi, lost their purpose with the introduction of the modern criminal code. Romantic tales of a disguised maiden tracking her parents' killer or family vendettas played out in dramatic tragedies are now things of the past. The knight-errantry of figures like Miyamoto Musashi has become a legend. Today, a well-ordered police force identifies the criminal and the law delivers justice. When the sense of justice is satisfied by society, there is no need for personal vengeance. If katakeuchi had merely been a hunger of the heart, feeding on the hope of satisfying itself with the lifeblood of the victim, as described by a New England clergyman, then it would not have vanished so easily with a few paragraphs in a criminal code, but it represented something more than bloodthirsty passion. As for seppuku, while it no longer exists as a legal practice, it continues to surface from time to time, and it will likely persist as long as the past is remembered. Although many painless and quick methods of self-immolation now exist, seppuku retains its unique, almost aristocratic position. Professor Morselli has argued that when suicide is carried out through painful means or prolonged agony, it is almost always an act of fanaticism, madness, or morbid excitement. However, a properly executed seppuku demands calmness, composure, and self-mastery, not fanaticism or madness. Dr. Strand divides suicides into two categories, the rational or quasi, and the irrational or true. Within this framework, seppuku is a prime example of the former, a rational act, imbued with purpose and dignity. From these bloody institutions and the overall spirit of Bushido, one can infer the prominent role the sword played in the life and discipline of society. It was widely accepted as a timeless truth. The sword was the soul of the samurai.